Picture this, if you will. December 1823, in what would one day become Montana. Not the Montana of tourist brochures and vacation cabins, but a raw, unforgiving wilderness where winter didn't just arrive, it invaded. And in the small settlement of Timber Creek, 40 families were about to learn a lesson that frontier life had been teaching for generations. Out here, you don't just fight the elements, you fight for your very survival. Sarah Whitmore stood in her family's storage shed, and what she saw there would haunt her dreams for years to come. Another barrel of salt pork that had cost her husband Thomas $12 precious, had turned that sickly green color that meant death. Not just the death of the meat, mind you, but potentially the death of anyone desperate enough to eat it. This was the 5th barrel this week. The 5th. Now, imagine you're Sarah for a moment. You've got children. Hollow-eyed children who ask you every day when the plans, next meal is coming. You've got neighbors whose kids are getting thinner by the day. And you're standing there, holding a haunch of venison that should have lasted your family through February, watching it rot in your hands. What do you do? What can you do? The traditional preservation methods that had worked back east, that had worked for their parents and grandparents, were failing spectacularly in this mountain climate. The smoking process that should have kept meat edible for months was leaving everything tainted with mold in the humid, bitter cold. Salt. Precious, expensive salt at $12 a barrel when most families were lucky to see $50 cash in a year simply wasn't enough. And those root cellars? The ones they dug into the rocky Montana soil with such hope and determination. They were becoming death traps. The soil was too rocky to dig deep enough, so the cellars fluctuated between freezing solid and thawing into a bacterial soup. One day your stored meat would be frozen harder than granite. The next day it would be warm enough to breed the kind of sickness that killed children. Think about the mathematics of desperation here. 40 families, let's say roughly 200 people counting children, watching their winter food supplies literally rot away while the snow piled deeper outside their doors. No railroad, no telegraph, no way to call for help or resupply. When you're facing starvation in December, spring might as well be on the moon. Thomas Whitmore, Sarah's husband and the settlement's founder, had positioned himself as the man with solutions. He'd built his storage cellar properly. Good stone construction, proper drainage, the works. But Thomas had also done something else. He'd turned survival into a business opportunity. While families like the Fairweathers were losing children to fever brought on by spoiled food, Thomas was selling his properly preserved meat at prices that would make a modern price gouger blush. Emergency pricing, he called it. Supply and demand, he said. But on December 23rd, 1823, supply and demand was about to meet something Thomas Whitmore hadn't counted on. The blizzard that hit that day was the kind that makes you understand why the old-timers spoke of winter like it was a living enemy. Winds that could knock a grown man off his feet, snow so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and cold that would freeze spit before it hit the ground. The guards at the settlement's perimeter were miserable, half-blind, and probably wondering why they'd ever left whatever civilized place they'd come from. So when a figure emerged from that white wall of wind and snow, looking more like a walking scarecrow than a human being, their first instinct was to shoot. And they nearly did. This person was missing 3 fingers on his left hand, clearly frostbitten, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been sewn together from scraps and animal hides. A vagrant, they thought. Maybe dangerous. Certainly not worth the risk. But then he spoke, and the words that came out of his mouth were going to change everything. I know why your meat spoils. 5 words. That's all it took. 5 words from a man they'd later call Mad Jerry, though his real name was Jeremiah Hawkins, 47 years old, a decade of living among the Shoshone behind him, and carrying knowledge that would save not just Timber Creek, but eventually thousands of lives across the frontier. The guards brought him to Thomas Whitmore's house, the biggest, warmest building in the settlement, naturally. And when Jeremiah Hawkins stood in front of the settlement's de facto leader, dripping melted snow onto expensive rugs, and claimed he could preserve enough meat to last 3 winters, Thomas did what any reasonable civilized man would do. He laughed, called him a fool, a mad mountain man with delusions of grandeur. After all, if the traditional methods weren't working, if salt and smoke and properly built cellars weren't enough, what could this half-frozen vagrant possibly know that they didn't? But across the room, Elizabeth Fairweather was listening with different ears. Elizabeth, who had just buried her youngest child, a fever brought on by eating spoiled meat because there was nothing else left. Elizabeth, who understood that sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely sources. And when the laughter died down, when Thomas had finished dismissing the mad mountain man's claims, Elizabeth Fairweather stepped forward and made an offer that would echo through history. "Use my barn," she said quietly. "Try your mad scheme, because when you've got nothing left to lose, even madness starts to look like hope." Elizabeth Fairweather's barn wasn't much to look at, a simple structure that had seen better days, with gaps in the walls wide enough to let the Montana wind whistle through. But to Jeremiah Hawkins, standing there on Christmas Eve morning with his frostbitten hand wrapped in bloody rags, it might as well have been a cathedral, because what he was about to build there would challenge everything these frontier families thought they knew about preserving food. The first thing that shocked the settlers was this: Hawkins didn't start digging down. Every root cellar, every storage pit, every food preservation method they'd ever seen involved going deep into the earth. Common sense, right? Get below the frost line. Protect your food from temperature swings. But Hawkins? Hawkins started building up, 12 feet high, 16 feet square, a structure that looked more like a small fortress than a food storage building. The settlers who gathered to watch, and there were plenty, because word travels fast in a community of 40 families facing starvation, thought the man had truly lost his mind. Building up into the wind, into the cold? It defied every instinct they had. But Hawkins had learned something during his decade with the Shoshone that these European settlers had never considered. The earth doesn't just sit there passively waiting for you to store your food in it. The earth breathes, and if you fight that breathing, if you try to seal everything up tight and pretend the natural world doesn't exist, you'll lose every time. "Watch the air," he told young Tom Fairweather, Elizabeth's surviving son, as he positioned the first log. "See how it moves? Feel how it wants to flow?" The boy nodded, probably not understanding but fascinated by this strange man who talked to the wind like it was a person. The construction technique was unlike anything the settlers had seen. Double walls. An inner wall and an outer wall with a gap between them. But instead of filling that gap with stone or clay like a sensible person would do, Hawkins packed it with sawdust from the settlement's mill. Sawdust, as if the wood shavings they swept up and burned for kindling could somehow keep food fresh. And those walls weren't just straight up and down, either. Hawkins angled them slightly, creating specific channels and pathways. Ventilation, he called it, though the word meant nothing to most of the watchers. Air needed to move through the structure, not around it. It needed to flow in precise patterns that would create what he called convection currents. Now, imagine trying to explain thermodynamics to a group of 1820s frontier families who are watching their children starve. You can't just say, hot air rises and cold air falls, creating a natural circulation system. You have to show them. And Hawkins did, using smoke from his pipe to demonstrate how air would move through his carefully designed channels. The most crucial element, the one that would make or break the entire system, was something he'd learned from an elderly Shoshone woman named Yellow Sky Woman. Before she died, she had shared with Hawkins the secret of what she called stone, breathing. River stones, laid in precise patterns, would create natural temperature regulation. Not random stones, mind you. Specific stones from specific parts of the river, arranged in layers that would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. As Hawkins worked through that Christmas Eve blizzard, his injured hand leaving bloody prints on every log he touched, more families gathered to watch. Some came out of curiosity, others came out of desperation. When your traditional methods are failing and your children are getting thinner every day, even the wildest scheme starts to look reasonable. Maria Santos brought him hot coffee and watched him work for hours without saying a word. The Hendricks family offered their teenage sons to help carry logs. Even some of Thomas Whitmore's supporters started drifting over from the main settlement to see what the mad mountain man was building, and Hawkins explained every step to anyone who would listen. This wasn't some secret technique he was hoarding for himself. The inner chamber, he said, showing them how to layer clean straw with chunks of charcoal. That's where the magic happens. The straw absorbs moisture, the charcoal filters the air, and together they create an environment where meat can rest without rotting. By the second day, December 25th, Christmas Day, the structure was taking shape, but Hawkins was clearly struggling. The cold was brutal. He'd been working for 36 hours straight, and that frost-bitten hand was getting worse. Elizabeth Fairweather tried to convince him to rest, to warm up by the fire, but he refused. Spring water waits for no one, he said, whatever that meant. The spring water, it turned out, was literal. Part of his design required access to the underground spring that fed Timber Creek, not the water itself, but the constant temperature that the earth maintained near a flowing water source. Hawkins dug a small channel that would allow air from near the spring to flow into his preservation chamber. 54 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. Nature's own temperature control system. On the third day, December 26th, Hawkins installed the final crucial element, the door. Not just any door, but a spring-loaded mechanism that would seal the chamber perfectly while still allowing easy access. The springs came from old wagon parts, donated by families who were starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, this crazy contraption might actually work. By sunset on that third day, Jeremiah Hawkins was hypothermic, exhausted, and barely conscious. But the ice house, because that's what everyone was calling it now, was complete. 12 feet high, 16 feet square, with ventilation channels that whistled softly in the wind, and an interior chamber that maintained a steady temperature just above freezing. The test came that very evening. Elizabeth Fairweather, the woman who had risked her barn on a stranger's promise, offered up her family's last fresh deer haunch. Killed that morning by her son Tom, it represented perhaps their final chance at fresh meat before spring. If Hawkins' system failed, the Fairweathers would be eating salt pork and praying it didn't kill them. They hung that haunch of venison in the new ice house alongside barrels of river ice that Hawkins had ordered cut and stored according to his precise specifications. Then they waited, and waited, while 3 more children in the settlement grew sicker from eating spoiled food, while Thomas Whitmore continued to sell his preserved meat at outrageous prices, while the Montana winter continued its relentless assault on human survival. 2 weeks later, on January 7th, 1824, as snow piled higher than the settlement's rooftops and the temperature dropped to 20 below zero, Jeremiah Hawkins walked to the ice house door. A crowd had gathered, nearly the entire settlement, because word had spread that this was the moment of Conspenic truth. Hawkins opened that spring-loaded door, reached into the perfectly controlled environment he had created, and retrieved Elizabeth Fairweather's deer haunch. The crowd gasped. The meat looked like it had been killed that morning. It smelled sweet and fresh. The color was perfect, the texture firm, and when Elizabeth cooked it that night, her family ate their first truly wholesome meal in weeks. But here's the thing that really made believers out of the skeptics. It wasn't just that the meat had been preserved. It was that the ice house had maintained its perfect temperature throughout 2 weeks of the worst weather anyone could remember. While the settlement's traditional storage methods continued to fail, while more families faced the choice between starvation and poisoning, Hawkins' mad scheme had created an environment where food could wait safely for hungry families. Within 3 days, every family in Timber Creek was begging Jeremiah Hawkins to teach them how to build their own ice house. By February of 1824, Timber Creek looked like a different settlement entirely. Where once there had been 40 families struggling individually against starvation, now there were 5 ice houses standing like monuments to human ingenuity, each one serving 8 families in a cooperative system that Jeremiah Hawkins had designed not just for preservation, but for survival. And Thomas Whitmore was furious. You have to understand the economics of what was happening here. Thomas had invested heavily in his stone storage cellar. He'd positioned himself as the settlement's food security expert, the man with the solutions, the leader who could keep families alive through the harsh Montana winters. His business model was simple: charge premium prices for a premium service during times of crisis. But now? Now families didn't need Thomas Whitmore's overpriced preserved meat. They had their own ice houses, their own preservation systems, their own food security. In the span of 6 weeks, Hawkins had destroyed Whitmore's monopoly on survival. The political upheaval was immediate and dramatic. When Thomas tried to impose a construction tax on new ice houses, claiming they were built on settlement land and therefore subject to his authority as founder, he discovered something that surprised him. The people had found their voices. Maria Santos, who had lost 2 children to hunger that terrible December, led a group of women to the settlement's meeting hall on February 15th. These weren't just any women, mind you. These were frontier women, women who had crossed a continent, women who had buried children and still kept going. When Maria stood up and declared that the settlement would hold its first democratic vote to override Thomas Whitmore's authority, she wasn't just challenging one man's power, she was challenging the entire system of frontier leadership. The vote wasn't even close. 32 families voted to establish democratically elected icehouse management committees. Only 8 families, mostly Thomas's relatives and business partners, voted to maintain the old system. Democracy had come to Timber Creek, and it had arrived in the form of food preservation technology, but the transformation went far deeper than politics. The icehouse committees became the settlement's first truly representative government. Each icehouse elected 2 managers, one to oversee daily operations and one to coordinate with the other icehouses. These 12 people formed Timber Creek's first town council, making decisions not through the authority of wealth or founding status, but through the consent of families who had learned to work together for survival. Jeremiah Hawkins watched this political revolution with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understood that technology and democracy were intimately connected. Free people preserve their own food, he wrote in his journal. Hungry people follow anyone who promises them a meal. The technical mastery spread as rapidly as the political changes. By spring of 1824, Hawkins had trained 12 apprentices in the precise construction methods. These weren't casual students either. These were people whose lives depended on getting every detail exactly right. They learned to recognize the proper river stones by touch, to angle ventilation channels within 2 degrees of optimal, to mix sawdust insulation in exact proportions. Young Tom Fairweather became Hawkins' star pupil, mastering not just the construction techniques, but the underlying principles. Why does the charcoal go between the straw layers? Hawkins would ask. Because charcoal absorbs impurities from the air while straw controls moisture, Tom would respond. And why do we use river stones instead of quarry stones? Because river stones hold steady temperature, while quarry stones fluctuate with the weather. This wasn't just apprenticeship, it was the creation of a new profession. Icehouse masters, they called themselves. Specialists in the science of preservation who could guarantee that meat would stay fresh for months instead of days. The economic impact was staggering, even by frontier standards. The buffalo hunt that May yielded 8,000 pounds of meat, more than any single hunt in the settlement's history. But here's the crucial difference. Previous hunts had managed to preserve maybe a quarter of that meat before spoilage set in. The rest was either eaten immediately, traded at desperate discounts to passing travelers, or simply lost to rot. The icehouses changed everything. 8,000 pounds of buffalo meat, properly preserved, feeding 40 families through the entire summer. Families that had never known food security suddenly found themselves with surplus. The Henderson family, who had nearly starved the previous winter, was able to preserve so much meat that they started trading with mining camps 50 miles away. And those ice houses weren't just maintaining refrigerator temperatures in the summer heat. They were maintaining exactly 34 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the outside temperature reached 90 degrees. Think about that for a moment. With no electricity, no mechanical refrigeration, no industrial infrastructure, Jeremiah Hawkins had created a system that rivaled anything the modern world would develop for another 50 years. The economic numbers tell the story better than words can. Families saved approximately $200 each that first year, money they would have spent on overpriced preserved food or emergency supplies. For context, most frontier families were lucky to see $200 in cash income for an entire year. The ice houses had effectively doubled their wealth while improving their nutrition and health. Elizabeth Fairweather, the woman who had risked her barn on a stranger's promise, found herself one of the wealthiest people in the barn settlement, not because she charged high prices for ice house access, but because her family's food security allowed them to focus on other economic activities. Her son, Tom, became a paid ice house instructor. Her daughter, Mary, started the settlement's first school, possible because Mary was no longer needed for constant food preservation work. The transformation of daily life was just as dramatic as the economic changes. Women, freed from the endless cycle of food monitoring and preservation crises, had time for education, for community building, for the kinds of activities that turn a survival camp into a real settlement. Children played new games, Icekeeper, where they pretended to manage ice houses, and buffalo storage, where they practiced the meat preservation techniques they'd watched their parents master. But not everyone was happy with the changes. Jacob Morse, a traveling trader who had held contracts to supply several settlements with preserved meat, saw his business model collapsing as word of the ice houses spread. In August of 1824, Morse arrived in Timber Creek with a legal document claiming that the ice houses violated his exclusive supply agreement with the settlement. When the ice house committees refused to shut down their operations, Morse tried a more direct approach. On the night of August 12th, fires started simultaneously at 3 different ice houses. Only quick action by settlement members, who had organized fire watch rotations as part of their cooperative security system, prevented total destruction. The arson attempt backfired spectacularly. Instead of destroying the ice houses, it unified the entire settlement behind their preservation system. Every family, even those who had initially supported Thomas Whitmore's authority, stood guard over the ice houses for the next month. Children took shifts as lookouts. Women organized patrol schedules. Men slept with rifles next to the preservation buildings that had become the foundation of their community's survival. Jeremiah Hawkins, watching families risk their lives to protect the system he had taught them, wrote in his journal, "Yellow sky. Woman's wisdom lives on. The people protect what feeds them, and what feeds them makes them free." But even as Timber Creek celebrated its transformation from a struggling survival camp into a thriving, democratic community, Hawkins was already looking toward the horizon, because he knew that what had worked for 40 families could work for 40,000 families. The question wasn't whether the ice house design could spread across the frontier. The question was how fast. Through 1825, something extraordinary happened across the American frontier. Word of the Timber Creek ice houses spread like wildfire through a drought-stricken forest, carried by traders, trappers, missionaries, and anyone else who moved between settlements. And everywhere the news traveled, the same desperate question followed: can you teach us? Timber Creek became a pilgrimage site, not for religious reasons but for survival. Delegations arrived from Wyoming, from Oregon Territory, from settlements so remote they didn't even have names yet. They came on horseback, in wagons, on foot through mountain passes that would challenge modern hikers, all to learn the secrets of food preservation that could mean the difference between life and death for their families. Jeremiah Hawkins could have become rich beyond imagination. Think about it. He possessed knowledge that was literally life-saving, in an era when most frontier families lived one failed harvest away from starvation. He could have charged whatever he wanted, set up exclusive contracts, created a business empire built on preservation technology. Instead, he did something that still amazes historians today. He insisted on teaching for free. Every delegation that arrived in Timber Creek received the same treatment: complete instruction in icehouse construction, detailed explanations of the underlying principles, hands-on training until they could build the structures themselves. Hawkins asked for only one thing in return: a promise that they would share the knowledge freely with anyone who needed it. knowledge that saves lives, he told a group of missionaries heading to Oregon, belongs to life, not to any one person. And above every icehouse door that Hawkins built or supervised, he carved the same thing: Yellow Sky Woman, teacher of preservation. The Shoshone elder who had shared these ancient techniques with a half-dead mountain man was honored in every structure, her wisdom acknowledged as the true source of the revolution in food preservation. By winter of 1825, 43 settlements across the frontier had functioning ice houses, from trading posts in what would become Wyoming to mining camps in the Oregon Territory, from military outposts to religious communities. The T5 design had spread across thousands of miles of wilderness. Historians estimate that these ice houses saved approximately 12,000 lives that harsh winter alone. 12,000 people who would have died from starvation, malnutrition, or food poisoning without access to reliable preservation. Tom Fairweather, now Hawkins' most skilled apprentice, kept detailed records of the spread. Settlement after settlement reported the same dramatic improvements: reduced food waste, improved nutrition, stronger communities, more stable economies. But they also reported something else. The icehouse communities were developing more democratic, cooperative forms of government. Just as in Timber Creek, the technology of food preservation was creating new forms of political organization. The winter of 1825 also brought validation from an unexpected source: the United States Army. Captain William Morrison, commanding officer at Fort Bridger, had initially dismissed reports of frontier ice houses as mountain man nonsense. But when his own supply lines failed during a brutal February blizzard, leaving his garrison facing starvation, he sent a desperate request to the nearest icehouse community for help. The response shocked him. Not only did they provide enough preserved meat to feed his soldiers, they refused payment and offered to teach his men the construction techniques. Morrison later wrote to his superiors, "These frontier preservation methods exceed anything in our military supply manuals. Recommend immediate adoption across all frontier installations." But just as the icehouse revolution was reaching its peak, just as Jeremiah Hawkins was being hailed as a hero across the frontier, something unexpected happened. On March 15, 1826, Jeremiah Hawkins disappeared. Tom Fairweather found his mentor's cabin empty, except for a brief note written in Hawkins' careful hand. "The wisdom is yours now. Keep it flowing like water, not frozen like ice." His tools were gone. His winter clothing was missing. But everything else, his journals, his detailed construction notes, his maps of successful icehouse locations, remained behind. It was as if he had simply decided that his work was finished and walked away from everything he had built. The theories about what happened to Jeremiah Hawkins became frontier legend. Some said he had returned to the Shoshone, fulfilling some unknown obligation to Yellow Sky Woman's people. Others believed he had headed north to the Canadian territories, carrying the preservation knowledge to settlements even more remote than those he had already helped. A few claimed they had seen him as far south as New Mexico, teaching icehouse construction to Spanish colonial communities. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more profound than any of the legends. In 1873, 47 years after his disappearance, workers renovating the old Fairweather homestead discovered a hidden compartment containing Jeremiah Hawkins' complete journal. The final entries revealed the full story of his time with the Shoshone and his relationship with Yellow Sky Woman. She had been the last keeper of preservation knowledge that stretched back centuries, techniques developed by indigenous peoples across North America for surviving harsh winters and food shortages. When Hawkins stumbled into her camp, half dead from exposure and grief, she had saved his life and then shared with him knowledge that her people had guarded for generations. But there was a condition. Hawkins had sworn a sacred oath to Yellow Sky Woman that if she taught him these life-saving techniques, he would ensure they spread as widely as possible. Not sold, not hoarded, not used for personal profit, but shared freely with anyone who needed them. The Icehouse Revolution wasn't just about one man's ingenuity. It was about honoring a promise made to a dying elder who had chosen to trust an outsider with her people's most precious knowledge. The journal's final entry, dated March 14, 1826, read, The debt is paid. 43 settlements, thousands of lives saved, the wisdom flowing like spring water to wherever it is needed. Yellow Sky Woman's gift has found its proper home, not with one man, but with all who hunger. The impact of Hawkins' work extended far beyond the frontier period. When Frederick McKinley patented the first commercial ice storage facility in 1852, he explicitly credited the mountain man's principles in his patent application. The ventilation techniques, the use of natural temperature regulation, the cooperative management structures, all became standard features of industrial food preservation. Even more significantly, the democratic governance structures that had emerged around icehouse management became models for frontier political organization. 3 states, Montana, Wyoming, and Oregon, can trace their township organization systems directly back to the cooperative committees that managed frontier icehouse communities. Today, food historians estimate that Jeremiah Hawkins' icehouse design influenced preservation techniques that saved over 50,000 lives before mechanical refrigeration became widely available. The cooperative principles he promoted helped create some of the most successful early democratic institutions in the American West. In modern Timber Creek, now a thriving town of 8,000 people, the original icehouse still stands. Preserved as a historical monument, it continues to maintain its steady 34 degrees Fahrenheit, using nothing but the natural systems that Hawkins designed over 200 years ago. Every December 23rd, families gather there for what they call Preservation Day. They serve fresh venison, perfectly preserved using techniques that blend Hawkins' methods with modern food safety standards. Children learn the story of the desperate winter when their community faced starvation, and how one man's refusal to let innocents die created a legacy that still shapes their world. But the most powerful memorial isn't the preserved building or the annual celebration. It's carved above the door of every icehouse that still stands across the former frontier. Yellow Sky Woman, teacher of preservation. A Shoshone elder's name, honored by communities she never saw, celebrating wisdom that bridged cultures and saved countless lives. In the end, that may be Jeremiah Hawkins' greatest achievement, not just the preservation of food, but the preservation of memory, the understanding that knowledge belongs to life itself, not to those who happen to possess it, the recognition that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin with the simplest acts of sharing. As long as people gather to share meals and tell stories, as long as communities work together to ensure that no one goes hungry, the spirit of Yellow Sky Woman's gift continues to flow like water, never frozen, always moving, always life-giving. That's the real legacy carved in ice. The understanding that in a world where winter always returns, our survival depends not on what we can hoard for ourselves, but on what we choose to share with others.